Releasing just prior to the PlayStation 5 Pro hardware launch, Call of Duty Black Ops 6 today finds itself with a set of unique enhancements over base PS5. To understand the nuts and bolts of this Pro upgrade though, we've got something extra special lined up for this video, thanks to a recent trip to meet the series' principal rendering engineer Michał Drobot and the talented team at Infinity Ward Poland. Now, Black Ops 6 is developed by multiple studios, chiefly Treyarch and Raven Software, but at IW's Poland office, I was able to get a behind-the-scenes tour of the tools used to make the game. Coming up then is a deep dive into the tech across the series, complete with rarely seen dev tool footage. I went in with 2 points of focus here, to firstly establish the exact details of how PS5 Pro is being utilised, the upgrades and the new features, and secondly, to see what major engine changes are made to Black Ops 6 as a whole. We've a lot to get our teeth into here, so let's get started. Let's kick off then with the topic of PS5 Pro support. This Pro update has been out in the wild for a good month already, and it's clear that Black Ops 6's upgrades run deeper than most. In summary, PS5 Pro users get improved visual settings while running at 60Hz, plus the adoption of PSSR to boost image quality at 4K. An anti-lag VRR feature is also added just on PS5 Pro, letting us run at above 60 frames per second while using that default graphics mode. Beyond that, there's a broad performance boost with the 120Hz mode enabled, where PS5 Pro reverts to base PS5 visual settings to deliver a higher frame rate. Let's start with the tweaks to PS5 Pro's default 60fps mode, with that 120Hz toggle disabled. In short, there are 4 improved visual settings, starting with a 2 to 4 times increase in shadow resolution, depending on the shadow type and your distance to it. This primarily affects environmental shadow maps, where quality is boosted across near and far shadows streaking across walls. In a side-by-side comparison with base PS5, the result is a subtle but often welcome reduction in stair-stepping across hard shadow lines. Next along, and perhaps more remarkably, there's the improved global illumination. Specifically, a screen space GI method is added just for PS5 Pro, simulating light bounce between surfaces. Thanks to Michał and his team, we have some great examples of this new SSGI in action. Note how light spills onto the underside of the arms stretching across the table surface here. It effectively beds each object into the scene, and in action, most notably affects the way a wall's colour reflects across a gun. Taking this scene at this poker table for example, we're able to look at normals in isolation, followed by the improved SSGI. Next, we have the upgraded screen space ambient occlusion, which is the third upgrade on PS5 Pro, and adds more detailed ambient shade to the scene to complete the final frame. This SSGI setting is something the team is especially proud of, as a rasterized technique that attempts to mimic the quality of path tracing. It's calibrated per scene to create as comparable a result to the team's internal path traced reference, though obviously at a fraction of the cost. This also of course extends to the way ambient shade is implemented. With the improved SSAO on Pro, there's a richer bed of shade added to the scene, and taking this interior shot of the headquarters for example, it creates a more lifelike final frame. We're getting upgraded shadows, SSGI and SSAO then, all of which leads us to the final PS5 Pro visual upgrade, improved screen space reflections. The ambition for this updated SSR, much like PS5 Pro's SSGI, is to match the team's internal path tracing reference as closely as possible. In comparison with base PS5, the main difference on Pro is in the accuracy of how reflections are occluded by objects in the scene. Switching back and forth on this skyline map, PS5 Pro greatly reduces the light leak around geometry, like walls, tables, thanks to the updated SSGI, all of which has a domino effect on the accuracy of the SSR as well. With everything combined, we get a change that might not stand out in the heat of Black Ops 6's action, but it does make a sensible use of Sony's mid-gen machine to refine the game's visuals. The other big change for PS5 Pro is of course the move to its native upscaler, PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution. PSSR only engages in the default 60fps mode, and in terms of the raw metrics, runs at 2560 by 1440 internally before being upscaled to a 4K frame. This is a dynamic resolution too, with adjustments being made horizontally to 1280 by 1440 lowest in more extreme cases to keep a stable frame rate. In terms of the perceptual payoff, the result is a clean one, but also, at times, more artifact prone than the engine's own custom TAA, as still used on base PS5. There are minor teething issues here, where PSSR introduces white flickering pixels in very specific scenes. This noise tends to appear more so in darkened, shaded areas, and in comparing the presentation of ultra-fine detail, like cloth, there is also a general smearing to the result next to the TAA on base PS5. Speaking to Mikhail Drobot directly about this, he confirms a fix is already in the pipeline for those PSSR artifacts, one that should roll out soon once the relevant patch passes through QA. The cause, it turns out, is simply down to PSSR not being fine-tuned for denoising the image in its current state. Interestingly, the team's own TAA method still has an advantage here. It's faster for a start, costing less than the 2.1 milliseconds per frame to use PSSR, a value also confirmed in our God of War deep dive. Added to that, the team's own TAA is custom tailored for denoising the specific type of output this engine generates. Thankfully, PSSR still works well in most scenes with the software-based variable rate shading in place. VRS only just made the cut 5 days before Black Ops 6 released, I'm told, and it does ultimately help squeeze the best results from each frame while also boosting performance. This example shot of VRS shows how complex a single frame is in its construction. For every group of pixels, the game can render at full, half, a third, or quarter resolution. Edges and hard geometric points are rendered at full res, for example. Also, a form of foveated rendering, as we see in VR headsets, is in place here too, putting a priority on details at the screen center, while there is a fall-off in quality towards the edges or flatter, simpler surfaces. Next up, in terms of frame rate testing on Pro hardware, the result is a good one. Black Ops 6 already ran optimally at 60 frames per second on base PS5 in the campaign mode, and despite PS5 Pro's visual upgrades to SSGI, SSR, AO and shadows, plus the taxing PSSR upscale, we do maintain a 60fps lock here. The good news is no mission goes below that mark based on my testing. That being said, there's one way to stress test base PS5 to force a repeatable drop in the form of its split screen mode. Using the derelict multiplayer map and fixing a second player's viewpoint across the action, base PS5 suffers constant drops to the 50fps line. Switching to PS5 Pro in that very same split screen mode and keeping that second player view in the same position, we're now almost entirely at the 60fps line, barring a few single dropped frames. In other words, it's a win-win situation on PS5 Pro. We get visual improvements, and on occasion where the base PS5 GPU is stressed, PS5 Pro is also able to hand in better performance. There's one other technical advance for PS5 Pro in the form of an anti-lag VRR technology on its 60fps mode. This engages so long as you have a 120Hz VRR display connected, but specifically keep the 120Hz mode disabled in the game menu itself. Developed in conjunction with Sony, an extra API call is made on PS5 Pro this way to predict the upcoming frame time. In this case, rather than VRR being used to hide drops under 60fps, as is so common in other games, Black Ops 6's VRR is instead used to render frames faster and go above 60fps where there's budget for it. This is achieved on the basis of logical prediction. Based on multiple previous frames, the engine is essentially able to recognize where there's slop, S-L-O-P, or in other words, a dependable chunk of frame time that is repeatedly not being used within a 16.7 millisecond budget for 60fps. And in using that slop, it's able to generate a frame earlier, decreasing latency in the process from the controller input to a displayed frame. Here's an example of how this all works, comparing base PS5 on left to PS5 Pro on the right, each with a debug visualizer to show how a frame time breaks down. The render cost for shadows, effects, and anti-aliasing are all factored in here, and ideally combined to deliver a frame in under 16.7 milliseconds. Note on PS5 Pro though, how there's a huge 4 to 8 milliseconds worth of slop in the total frame time at the top there, a pretty large chunk being unused per frame. It's often larger than base PS5s, and that's of course despite the heftier 2.1 millisecond chunk taken up by PSSR for anti-aliasing. Rather than letting all that processing power go to waste though, PS5 Pro is instead able to push out a frame quicker ahead of schedule. The result is more frames per second than would otherwise be possible. In most scenarios on my own VRR display, which we do need to film by camera to show the HUD reading, frames are actually output at anywhere between 60 to 120 FPS, but typically performance hangs between 80 to 90 during the opening mission. Only one major drop, briefly under 60 FPS, is recorded while exploding a planted C4 on the open world mission. Beyond that, this anti-lag VRR mode genuinely works, and the team claims it's more responsive and lower latency than running the game unlocked with the game's actual 120Hz output mode active. Wrapping up our tour of PS5 Pro features, let's switch to the 120Hz mode. The 120Hz mode on PS5 Pro removes all of the above features, the visual upgrades, the PSSR, and also that anti-lag VRR technology. In its place, Pro hardware instead runs at 1440p internally with the team's in-house TAA, using the same graphics quality settings as base PS5's 60Hz mode. In direct comparison between base and Pro consoles, we're seeing an uptick in performance by as much as 35% here too. The result being, spots where the game suffered from dips to 95 FPS or so previously, like the initial walk forward on the first mission, now run at mostly 120 FPS. To be clear, we do not have a perfect lock on PS5 Pro, and drops to 100 FPS are still very possible, but the margin is certainly tightened now. That about covers the PS5 Pro specific upgrades, but there are a great many new engine features making a debut in Black Ops 6. To demonstrate each one at the IW Poland office, Mikhail booted up a so-called White Room, a neatly labelled test suite that lets us see each aspect of the engine running in isolation. From material lighting to volumetric fog, particle effects, or terrain streaming, all parts of Call of Duty's tech has its own small, kind of torture chamber. It presents as a science experiment in this way, a means for the development team to zero in on new technologies for Black Ops 6 and beyond before they actually ship. Among the many new additions to the game is weather grade volumes, or WGVs. In a nutshell, WGVs allow mud, water, oil, or snow to leave a persistent mark on a player's body, with only the specific body part coming into contact being affected. It's best shown off in this third-person view, though in practice, you'll see it on enemies during gameplay. One great dev footage example sent by the team has a player stood next to this 4x4 vehicle. The acceleration of the rear wheels causes mud to spray upwards, where the momentum of the car and the velocity of the spray is simulated by large spherical volumes. These volumes constantly adjust and change based on the car's position, and then, to measure the point of that mud's impact on the player, a 3D voxel-based system is used, with each one individually triggering based on contact with a muddy surface or water or snow. It's a way to sample the impact of effects, or even weather conditions. Put in our own example, looking at the oil fires of Mission 1, the way oil droplets build up on our fatigues adds a note of realism, while in multiplayer, it also gives a hint as to where the enemy player has last been. For that reason, this WGV system is enabled on all consoles for competitive fairness. Another highlight of recent Call of Duty games is the handling of terrain, which breaks down into multiple layers. First, we have the virtual texturing system, or super terrain. This was debuted in Warzone and fine-tuned later in 2021's Vanguard, allowing a giant, detailed texture map to be generated procedurally ahead of the player. We're talking virtual acres of landscape that adjusts its detail based on proximity and player view. This is helpfully put in example using the dev tools, which show how the overall texture map is filled out in tiles, where dividing the load into chunks like this helps to manage system memory. Next, running on top of that is of course the grass. For Call of Duty, the presentation of grass across multiple consoles is very carefully balanced, often to ensure visibility stays the same for online cross-gen matchmaking. As you might imagine, grass density and draw distance are matched up between platforms to avoid any competitive advantage for any player, and you'll notice, rather than grass blades popping in abruptly on the distance, they are in fact discreetly lowered beneath the ground to ease that transition. Rounding out, there's the deformable terrain. The campaign modes of recent Call of Duty titles include clutter, or deformable grass, which leaves a trail as you crawl through. It's perhaps best shown off in this White Room footage. Likewise, we have deformable snow for levels that need it, achieved via tessellation. It's another tool in the box for developers to use, where, again, vertex deformation is a relatively new feature for the series. It lets these thick layers of snow capture player movement at a high resolution, the result being this persistent trail. All of this helps players leave a tangible mark on the world, especially in the campaign mode. Last but not least, we have the addition of advanced glass. This is used extensively in Black Ops 6, even across the multiplayer maps, to simulate the gradual fracturing and structural breakdown of a glass pane. So, as you can see here, the integrity of the glass breaks down with each shot, and it even factors in the glass pane's thickness, while lighting from behind the glass is realistically simulated as it hits the pane. The number of additions made to the series, and Black Ops 6 especially, are too varied and many to do justice in one video. We're seeing improvements to the game's fog effect, with screen space fog gathering used more extensively across each map after being introduced in Modern Warfare 3. There's also improvements to water caustic simulation in select moments, adding reflections and refractions from the lit water surface. All of these points are huge labours of love for the team, and given the rapid nature of the series' action, don't always get the credit they deserve. The key takeaway being that every Call of Duty title pushes the technical envelope in myriad ways. Black Ops 6 continues that evolution, in some respects building on the technologies and ideas in Vanguard, Warzone and Modern Warfare 3, while also pioneering new ones. With the launch of PS5 Pro in particular, the team is able to add some impressive features over the top. The anti-lag VRR mode, the adoption of PSSR, and the improved global illumination and reflections. It's a culmination of years of work, where PS5 Pro is powerful enough to facilitate each feature in the console space. Again, a huge thank you to the team at Infinity Ward Poland for giving up so much of their time and providing all this amazing footage. It's really appreciated, and from what I've seen, only scratches the surface of the work being put into each game. Still, hopefully, it gives you an insight into what Black Ops 6 brings to the table this year, while also pointing to where the series intends to go next. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.